Do you hear the whispers upon the midnight tide, Shardwalker? In the grim darkness of the far future, even the ocean's waves carry the stain of horrors unseen. Tonight, we beckon you toward that darkness. This is a tale of dread and mystery, born from the blackest depths, terror from the tides, a frontier world, a forlorn coast, and an ancient terror stalking the shores, along with brave souls standing in its way. All await you in this saga. But before we descend beneath these dark waters, ensure you are subscribed to Grimdark Shards and sound the bell of notification. By doing so, you shall be summoned whenever we unveil another grim saga from the 41st millennium. Support, as always, remains appreciated, not mandated. Those who wish to offer tribute can find the link in the archives below. Now, steel your souls and hold your breath. The descent is about to begin. The ocean world's night was a tapestry of black water and storm-thick cloud. The moon hung as a mere ghost behind thunderheads. A solitary beacon tower stood on a craggy atoll above the waves, a slender needle of plasteel and rockcrete crowned with a rotating, warning lumen. Its golden beams sliced through swirling coastal fog with each slow pass, a lonely guardian's eye scanning the darkness for wayward vessels. Inside the beacon's control room, Tide Warden First Class Marek Holden completed a routine systems check. The air stank of salt and machine oil. Rattling shutters hinted at rising winds outside, and each time lightning flickered on the horizon, the cramped room flashed stark white. Holden took a sip of Ricaf gone lukewarm, massaging the ache in his prosthetic leg. Another storm coming, he noted, eyeing the barometer's drop and the distant forks of light in the clouds. On the console before him, green runes blinked a steady rhythm. All was well in theory. He flipped a Vox switch and spoke, his voice rough from hours of solitude. Beacon Theta Delta to Harbor Command. Status is calm. Visibility dropping with fog. Storm expected within the hour. Over. He released the transmit key and waited. Only static hissed in reply, likely the weather playing havoc with shortwave comms again. The colonists on the main island 50 kilometers away would hear him once the squall eased, he reassured himself. They always did. Holden had manned this isolated beacon for 5 years, and if it had taught him anything, it was patience. Out here in the endless mist-shrouded sea, patience was a virtue that kept a man sane. Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now. Holden stood and stretched, joints stiff. Far below, waves crashed against the atoll's base with increasing ferocity, their rhythmic roar vibrating up through the floor plating. He began his final walk around the chamber, checking the seals on the hatch and the glow of the lumen strips hanging from the low ceiling. They cast a sickly yellow light that barely pushed back the gloom in the corners. He tried humming an old folk tune to fill the emptiness. Perhaps when his rotation ended next week, he'd request a transfer to a more populated posting, maybe one of the new lighthouse platforms closer to the fishing grounds, where he could share a drink and a story with fellow Tide Wardens. He was halfway through his circuit when a metallic clank reverberated up from below, faint but distinct against the storm's howl. Holden froze. The sound was not the familiar groan of the tower under assault by waves, nor the wind rattling guy wires. It was something else, something deliberate. It came again. Clank, scrape, clank, echoing as if something heavy dragged along the exterior ladder that ran the length of the beacon. "Hello?" he called, heart quickening. Through a narrow vision slit, he peered into the rain-lashed dark. He saw nothing beyond the glass, but the reflection of his own anxious eyes. The beacon's great lumen completed another rotation, and for a moment as it swept past, he thought he caught a glimpse of movement. A dark shape against the ladder, maybe a large seabird taking shelter, or a bit of drifting flotsam tossed by the surf. Lightning flashed, and the tower's power momentarily fluctuated. The lights dimmed, the machinery hummed back unevenly. Halden's skin prickled. Procedure dictated he check for damage if something was caught on the structure. Perhaps a piece of driftwood had lodged itself, or thrown for bid. One of the coastal patrol skimmers had wrecked nearby, and a survivor was climbing up. Grabbing his handheld Vox, he tuned to the emergency channel. Beacon Theta Delta calling any vessel in distress, respond, he barked, pressing the receiver to his ear. Only crackling static answered, punctuated by an odd burst of distorted sound. No reply. Holden hesitated, then shrugged on his weather cloak and unholstered the service las pistol from the wall mount. Rain or no rain, he wouldn't ignore a possible mayday. With reluctance, he undogged the heavy hatch leading out to the external platform. Instantly, the gale tugged at the door, wind-driven rain needling his face. He stepped out onto the circular catwalk that ringed the tower. Far below, the ocean churned, whitecaps glinting whenever the beacon light swept over them. The metal grating was slick under his boots. Shielding his eyes against horizontal rain, Halden peered over the railing. Another flash of lightning tore the sky, and his stomach lurched. For an instant, he could have sworn he saw a silhouette clinging to the ladder some meters below. Something man-shaped, but far larger and hunched. It was there only as a black cutout against a strobing backdrop of electric blue clouds, and then darkness swallowed it again. "Who's there?" he shouted into the void, his voice whipped away by the wind. "Identify yourself. This is an Imperial facility." He forced authority into his tone, though his heart hammered in his chest. The storm answered with a peal of thunder. Holden gripped his las pistol tightly, the weapon suddenly feeling pitifully light. Surely it was just debris or an overactive imagination. Yet every instinct from his years in the Planetary Defense Force screamed that something was very wrong out here. Another clank, louder now, reverberated through the structure beneath him. It came from directly below, near the maintenance hatch at the tower's base. "Emperor, protect me," Holden thought as dread coiled in his gut. Something's climbing up. The idea was absurd. The ladder rungs were slick and meant for servitor maintenance crews, not for any sane man in this weather. But as he listened, he could hear it clearly. The thump of weight on metal rungs, hand over hand, ascending. Halden backed toward the open hatch behind him. Rain plastered his grey hair to his brow. "Stay back," he hollered into the howling dark. "I'm armed." With his thumb, he switched the las pistol's power setting to maximum. Lightning flared again, and this time, he saw it clearly. The figure climbing the ladder was only one level down now, almost within reach of the platform. It was massive, far larger than any man, and its outline was bulky and armored. A crack of thunder followed, and in that booming moment the golden beacon light swung across it, giving Halden a split-second glimpse. Midnight blue armor plating, a leering skull-like helm, and eyes glowing a baleful red. Panic seized him. Halden fired blindly into the rain. The red lash shot lanced down, illuminating sheets of water in a crimson flash. He thought he saw the beam hit the shape squarely, but if it did, it had no effect. A deep, distorted chuckle rolled up over the wind, a sound utterly devoid of human warmth. Halden's blood ran cold. This was no lost sailor or pirate. This was a nightmare clawing its way out of the ocean's depths. He emptied the pistol's power cell in a frenzied burst, scarlet bolts cutting through the night. One shot struck the ladder with a shower of sparks. Another sizzled into the waves. Still that dark shape kept coming. Holden swore and stumbled backward through the hatch into the control room, slamming the door shut. His hands shook as he spun the locking wheel until it clanged tight. The dim lumen strips overhead flickered from the power drain of his shots. Thunder crashed, so close it rattled the tower. Heart pounding, Holden lurched back to the Vox panel and switched it to the broadband distress frequency. Salt water dripped from his coat onto the floor as he leaned in. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he shouted, unable to keep the tremor from his voice. "Beacon Theta Delta under attack. Unknown hostile. I say again, unknown hostile is..." A thunderous boom shook the tower, cutting him off. Dust rained from the ceiling. Holden threw a wild glance at the hatch. It bulged inward under an immense impact, a dent the size of a fist. "Emperor, save us." They were trying to break in. "Harbor Command, respond," he begged into the Vox, voice cracking. "Something's here." Static was his only reply. That, and the rising whine of the gale outside. Halden's breath came in shallow gasps. He backed away from the hatch, pistol still clutched in white-knuckled hands though it was spent. Another impact, and metal screeched. The hatch's upper hinge tore half loose, bolts ricocheting across the room. On the third blow, the entire iron door flew off its frame in a spray of twisted steel. The intruder stooped in the doorway, and Holden felt hope shrivel in his breast. It was a giant clad in dripping blue-black plate edged with brass. Rainwater steamed off the armor's snarling, bat-winged shoulder guards. The thing's helmet was fashioned as a death's head, complete with a fanged grin. And yet the skull visage appeared half-flayed, streaks of crimson giving the grotesque impression of exposed muscle. Red eye lenses set in sunken sockets regarded him with almost casual malice. Holden let out a shuddering cry and squeezed the trigger again, forgetting the pistol was empty. The weapon clicked impotently. The giant stepped fully into the control room, and Holden was forced back against the console by its sheer presence. It loomed head and shoulders taller than him, nearly 8 feet of nightmare-given flesh, or steel, he thought numbly. A dark blue Aquila. No, a twisted parody of one, more like a bat with outstretched wings, spread across its chest plate. Trophies of bone and desiccated flesh hung chained at its waist. In one oversized gauntlet, the intruder clutched a cruel-looking, hook-bladed weapon, as long as a man's arm. In the other, it held a sidearm unlike any Holden had seen. A heavy pistol that whirred with internal gyros. A bolter, some distant part of Holden's mind realized. He'd seen illustrations in PDF briefings. A single round from such a weapon could tear a man in half. The giant regarded him for a heartbeat of silence. Then a voice crackled out from its Vox grill. A rasping, artificial growl layered with otherworldly distortion.
"No escape,"
it said mockingly, each syllable drawn out like a predator savoring its prey's fear. Holden braced himself and raised the only thing he had left, a steel spanner from his tool belt. But despair was flooding through him. The giant tilted its skull helm, almost curious. Then with a click and a wicked snikt, blades snapped forth from the wrist of its gauntlet. 3 curved claws crackling with caged lightning. Holden had an instant to understand just how truly doomed he was. He screamed as the intruder struck. Lightning claws scythed, shearing through the console and through Holden's torso, in one awful sweep. Blood sprayed across flickering dials and cogitator screens. The pain was blinding, absolute. Marek Holden collapsed to the floor in pieces, eyes wide, his final breath escaping in a weak, wet choke. As darkness closed in, he dimly heard the giant crouch over him. The Vox-distorted voice whispered almost gently into his failing ears, words from humanity's oldest nightmares.
"We have come for you."
A clap of thunder shook the night. and the rotating beacon light spun on, indifferent, as beacon Theta Delta fell silent. Marek Holden's blood ran in dark rivulets between the deck plates. In the howling storm outside, a guttural laughter rose and then faded into the wind. Far across the waves, on the main colonial island, a few night shift Vox operators at Breakers Point Harbor thought they heard, through bursts of static, the faint echo of a scream and a single ominous phrase, "Come for you," before beacon Theta Delta's signal winked out. By dawn, that distant light was still extinguished, and the mist-shrouded horizon gave no hint of the horror that had taken place. Varen Holt jerked awake in his bunk, heart pounding. For a moment he wasn't sure what had roused him. The lingering echo of a nightmare, or something real. He lay still in the dark, listening. The trawler's hull creaked softly as it bobbed at dock. Rain drummed on the deck above in a steady patter. Just the storm, he told himself, exhaling slowly. But the dream had felt so vivid, running through endless darkness, screams on the wind, a terrible voice whispering from the void. He swung his legs over the side of the bunk and pressed his palms to his eyes. "Emperor, get a hold of yourself." It was barely dawn. The small crew cabin was awash in grey half-light, filtering through the porthole. Across from him, young Thomas lay snoring in his hammock, oblivious. Holt envied the lad's ability to sleep through anything. The old sergeant rubbed the back of his neck, fingers tracing the edges of the scar that ran from his jaw down to his collarbone, a memento from his soldiering days. At times like this, the ache of old wounds reminded him that the past was never truly gone. Reaching to the shelf above his bunk, Holt grabbed the battered Vox receiver he kept there. Static greeted him when he thumbed it on. He routinely monitored the beacon frequency at night, a habit from countless fishing runs through unpredictable waters. Now, as he adjusted the dial, he caught a crackle of broken transmission. Delta under attack, unknown, static. The signal was faint and warbling with atmospheric noise. Holt's spine stiffened. Beacon Theta Delta was one of the automated lighthouses off the archipelago's edge. Under attack? That made no sense. Perhaps he'd misheard. Frowning, he pressed the receiver tighter to his ear, straining to pass the garbled noise. Through the tinny hiss, he picked up what sounded like the ghost of a scream. Or was it just feedback? Then a final burst cracked through. "Some here. Come for you." The channel dissolved into a flat buzz. Holt felt a chill run through him. "Come for you." What in the Emperor's name? He stood abruptly, nearly cracking his head on the low ceiling. That phrase rattled in his memory with inexplicable dread, though he couldn't place why. Probably a corrupted Vox loop, he reasoned. A storm could scramble signals into nonsense. Still, it set him on edge. He dressed hurriedly in a salt-stained canvas jacket and headed up the companionway to the main deck, rainwater dripping from above. Outside, Breakers Point Harbor was waking to a grim, grey morning. The colonial port stretched around a natural bay, its dozen piers bristling with fishing boats and cargo skiffs. Normally, a beacon light would still be visible far out at sea, but Holt saw no golden beam on the horizon, only a bank of mist and drizzle merging sea and sky into one leaden mass. Even accounting for the dawn light, it was odd. Theta Delta beacon was never turned off. As Holt secured the tarp over his trawler's deck gear, a pair of dock workers hurried by under oilskin hoods. One raised a hand in greeting. "Storm's a mean one, Captain," the man called over the rumble of distant thunder. Holt nodded distractedly, still gazing out toward where the beacon's light should be. "Either of you hear anything on the Vox last night?" he asked. The workers exchanged looks. "No, sir. Comms were all static round midnight," one replied. "Lightning must have knocked something out. Beacon's gone dark too. Harbour Master's sending someone to check on old Holden once the weather eases." Holt grunted, mind racing. Marek Halden, an old comrade from his PDF days, was the keeper at Theta Delta. The thought of that gruff, dependable fellow under attack was absurd. Perhaps Halden had taken ill, or the generator failed. But Holt's instincts nagged. He'd learned long ago not to ignore them. He finished tying down the nets and made for the quayside. Breakers Point's docks bustled despite the foul weather. Fishermen unloaded the night's catch of razorfish under the eaves of prefab sheds, and servitors trundled crates of salted kelp toward the smoke-belching processing mill. A group of colonist women, shawls wrapped tight, scurried across the muddy street toward the chapel of the Emperor's Light, likely to offer morning prayers for calm seas. Holt threaded through the activity. Tall and broad-shouldered, he had the weathered look of a man who had lived 2 lifetimes, one as a soldier on a distant world, and another here as a humble trawler captain, hauling the Emperor's bounty from the deep. The transition had not been easy. On restless nights, he still heard the staccato of gunfire and smelled the cordite and blood of battlefields long past. But he had come to this newly colonized ocean planet, Cortusa, to escape all that, to find a measure of peace on open waters. He reached the harbour master's office, a small vox shack overlooking the piers, and ducked inside. Warmth and the smell of recaf enveloped him. Harbour Master Luron, a rotund man with perpetual worry lines, glanced up from a cogitator logbook. "Captain Holt." "Throne, you look like you slept in a bait locker," Luron said, noting Holt's drawn face. "Feel like it too," Holt replied dryly. He got straight to the point. "I heard something odd on the Vox around 0300. Sounded like Theta Delta transmitting a distress call." Luron blinked. "Distress? We lost contact with Theta Delta late last night. Figured Holden's transmitter was on the fritz again. He mentioned intermittent outages last week." Holt shook his head. "This was more than static. I'm sure I heard him yelling about an attack just before it cut off." The harbour master's skeptical frown shifted to concern as Holt's tone sank in. "Throne, you think he's in trouble?" Luron set down his mug. "We didn't receive any formal mayday. Could be atmospheric interference, making it sound worse." "Maybe," Holt allowed. "But I'd rather check than sit here guessing. Who were you planning to send out?" "Patrol skimmers grounded for repairs," Luron said, scratching his balding pate. "I was about to ask old Ryman to take his launch once the storm calmed." "Ryman's a fine sailor, but he's no soldier." Holt's voice hardened with resolve that came unbidden, the echo of his days giving orders. "If something's gone wrong at that beacon, you'll want someone with a steadier hand and a bit of trigger time along." Luron exhaled in relief. "I was hoping you'd volunteer, truth be told. Sergeant." He slipped in Holt's old PDF rank with a faint, grateful smile. "Emperor knows we don't have many with combat experience around here." Holt simply nodded, trying not to show how natural it felt to fall back into a leadership role. "I'll take my trawler. She can handle the seas, storm or not. We'll get to Theta Delta and see what's what." "I'll inform the militia," Luron said, already reaching for the Vox transmitter. "Captain Severin can send a couple of his men with you for security just in case. Emperor willing, it's nothing but—" He trailed off, unspoken worst-case scenarios hanging in the air. A lighthouse beacon didn't just go dark without reason. Neither man voiced the thought that it might be something as dire as pirates or Xenos. Cortusa was remote and newly settled, but it had known no significant threats in its short colonial history, just the daily perils of ocean storms and a few dangerous native species beneath the waves. The Planetary Defense Force's main concerns until now had been fending off megalodon eels from the fish pens and keeping the tithe quotas of seafood and biomass on schedule. "Severin will meet you at Pier 3 within the hour," Luron confirmed after a brief Vox exchange. "Watch yourselves out there, Viren." Holt managed a tight smile. "Always do." As he left, he caught the harbour master quietly crossing himself with the sign of the Aquila and whispering, "Emperor, protect them." That simple benediction buoyed Holt's spirits. Whatever lay ahead, he would meet it head-on. Back at his trawler, the Miral's Grace, Holt found Thomas already making ready. The gangly youth looked up from tying down a coil of rope. "We heading out, Captain?" he asked, blinking rain from his eyes. At 19, Thomas had the lean build of a long-distance swimmer and an eager face not yet hardened by the horrors of the galaxy. Holt felt a pang of protectiveness. The boy had lost his father in the colony's founding months to a submersible accident, and Holt had taken him under wing ever since. "Aye," Holt answered, clapping him on the shoulder. "Something's not right at Theta Delta Beacon. We're going to check on Tidewarden Holden." Thomas's brow furrowed. In this weather, the point's barely visible. Indeed, fat raindrops fell from a slate sky, and a milky fog was creeping in off the bay. "We'll manage. Tie everything down good and tight, and load the emergency kit. Flares, medkit, rebreathers. Just in case." Holt moved with practiced efficiency, prepping the vessel. The Grace was a stout 30-meter coastal trawler with a reinforced hull and a small aft cabin. Not fast, but dependable. Much like Holt himself, he often mused. Its diesel engines, refitted to run on promethium distilled from local algae, coughed to life with a belch of smoke as he engaged the ignition runes. With lines cast off, the trawler chugged toward Pier 3. There, 3 figures awaited. 2 in the grey fatigues of the colonial PDF, clutching las rifles under their ponchos, and between them, a taller man in a flak greatcoat with a copper captain's pin on the collar. Captain Arlen Severin looked all business, a hardline career officer sent from off-world to whip the colony's militia into shape. Holt had never much cared for Severin's stiff formality, but he couldn't deny the man's competence. "We'll make this quick," Holt said as the PDF men came aboard. He offered a calloused hand to Severin, who gripped it firmly. "Appreciate the company, Captain." Severin nodded curtly. "Harbour Master briefed us. Beacon offline and possible distress. These are Troopers Markin and Gren," he added, introducing the 2 younger soldiers as they all ducked under the rain into the aft deck's cover. Both troopers looked a bit wide-eyed, likely their first urgent deployment. Markin, stocky and red-haired, managed a polite sergeant in greeting. Word travelled that Holt was ex-PDF, and old habits of respect died hard. Gren, lanky and seasick pale, said nothing but checked his lasgun's charge nervously. "And I'm Thomas," piped the deckhand as he secured a tarp over the passengers' rucksacks. He flashed a friendly grin that neither trooper returned. They were too busy exchanging uncertain glances at the choppy water beyond the pier. "Right. Everyone hold fast," Holt ordered. He eased the throttle forward. The Miral's Grace lurched against the swell, then powered out of the harbour, its prow cutting into the fog. The colony's shoreline receded behind them, a cluster of hab blocks and rigging cranes fading into grey. As the open sea embraced them, Holt narrowed his eyes and focused on the heading. The beacon lay to the southeast. Even shrouded by cloud and rain, by day its strobing light should have been visible. But the horizon remained dull and empty. A gnawing worry grew for his old friend Marek, and that strange Vox cry echoed again in his mind. "Come for you." He hadn't mentioned it to Luron, not wanting to sound crazed. Perhaps he wouldn't need to. Likely it was just storm static playing tricks. The PDF troopers huddled near the wheelhouse, trying to stay out of the driving rain that pelted the deck. Captain Severin stood behind Holt at the helm, one gloved hand gripping the roof rail. "Sergeant, what do you honestly think we're dealing with?" he asked quietly, voice nearly lost under the engine's drone. Holt appreciated the use of his old rank. It meant Severin was treating him as an equal in this. "Don't know," Holt replied, eyes on the compass. "A beacon's an odd target. Pirates, maybe, though none operate this far out to my knowledge. The Administratum would have warned us if so." He paused, keeping his tone even. "I caught fragments of Halden's last transmission. Sounded bad. He mentioned an attack, then nothing. If it is pirates or smugglers, they'll regret stirring up a hornet's nest. But truthfully, I've never heard Halden that panicked. It wasn't a normal situation." Severin pursed his lips. "Understood." He patted the holstered las pistol at his hip. "We'll proceed with caution. Emperor willing, it's just an equipment failure and Halden slipped and broke a leg or something." Holt gave a thin smile. "He'll be embarrassed if we turn up en masse to rescue him from a misfiring cogitator." The thought eased the tension slightly. Time crept by as the trawler forged ahead into the mist and rain. The tension on board was palpable. Even Thomas, usually irrepressible, was quiet as he coiled mooring lines and triple-checked that the Grace's small harpoon launcher, intended for snagging large catches, was loaded and ready. Holt caught the boy furtively rubbing the little Aquila pendant he wore around his neck for luck. Good, Holt thought. A little faith wouldn't go amiss. Suddenly the fog ahead lightened to reveal a darker shape, the outline of the beacon tower emerging from the gloom. "There," Holt called. He throttled down, and the trawler bobbed in the choppy waters off the atoll's lee side. Beacon Theta Delta rose from a foundation of jagged rock, its surface slick with algae. Something was clearly wrong. The tower's upper platform was blackened and cracked, as if from an explosion. The rotating lumen that should crown it was shattered. Shards of the great lamp hung loosely in its housing, no light shining. Only intermittent sparks popped from severed wiring. The metal external ladder running up the side dangled in places, torn and bent. "Throne of Terror," Captain Severin muttered, removing his cap and letting the rain plaster his dark hair to his scalp. Trooper Gren audibly gulped. Holt set his jaw. The beacon looked like a war zone. He guided the trawler toward the small service pier at the tower's base. Usually, an automated beacon had a single maintenance dock just large enough for a dinghy. The Grace was a tight fit, but with Thomas at the bow fending off with a gaff pole, they managed to snugger alongside. Holt tied up, then grabbed his personal las carbine from the cabin rack. It had been years since he'd fired the weapon in anger, but he maintained it meticulously. Setting its charge pack, he slung it and led the group onto the slippery rocks. A narrow stair, slick with seaweed, wound up to the beacon's entrance platform. The rain eased to a steady drizzle, visibility improving slightly. Holt's boots squelched on each step as he ascended, Severin and the two troopers close behind. Thomas bringing up the rear with a lantern, and Holt's spare auto-pistol holstered at his side. At the top, the scene stopped them cold. The heavy plasteel hatch to the control room lay on the platform in a crumpled heap, as if some giant fist had smashed it outward from the inside. The doorway gaped open, showing only darkness beyond. Jagged shards of the door frame hung twisted where the hinges had been, the metal torn like foil. The PDF troopers exchanged alarmed looks. Holt's heart sank. This was no lightning strike or simple accident. It looked as though a breaching charge had blown the door off, yet there were no scorch marks from explosives. It was more like brute force had ripped it out. "Markin, cover our six. Gren with me," Severin ordered quietly. Markin turned and knelt facing back down the stair, lasgun ready. Gren swallowed and raised his rifle, following 2 steps behind Severin and Holt. Holt clicked on the lantern Thomas handed him. Its beam cut into the ruined control room. Broken glass, papers, and bits of machinery littered the floor. The air inside smelled of ozone, scorched metal, and an underlying coppery tang that Holt recognized at once. Blood. He held up a fist to halt the others, then carefully stepped through the doorway. The lantern's light danced across carnage. Emperor have mercy. It was everywhere. The central cogitator console was demolished, sliced apart as if by enormous blades. The far wall was spattered with a broad arc of dried blood, almost black in the lantern glow, trailing down to a congealed puddle beneath the grated floor. Amid a tangle of severed wires and sparking panels lay something that made Trooper Gren gag aloud. A human arm, torn off at the shoulder, clad in a shredded grey sleeve. The limb looked gnawed, as though something had chewed the flesh before discarding it. The hand still gripped a broken las pistol. Thomas clapped a hand over his mouth, eyes wide with shock. Holt felt a chill settle in his bones. That sleeve had the reflective safety stripe of a beacon keeper's uniform. Holden's uniform. Severin moved forward, stepping gingerly around the scattered debris. He crouched and pressed 2 fingers to a smeared patch of blood on the floor. Dry, he murmured. Likely happened during the night. He was admirably composed, but Holt saw the captain's jaw muscles tighten. None of them had expected gore on this scale. A damp breeze blew in through the open doorway behind them, and wisps of fog slithered along the floor. Holt advanced further, boots squelching. There, on the wall next to the shattered Vox unit, something was smeared in blood. He angled the lantern's beam. It was a crude symbol drawn in broad, wet strokes. A circle. No, an 8-pointed star, each point an arrow radiating outward. A chill prickled Holt's skin as he realized what it was. He did not recognize it from any imperial heraldry. In fact, it reminded him of something far more sinister, a sign of corruption, of chaos. Holt's mind flashed back to the rebel war on Varadon IV, to a similar scrawl he had seen painted in blood on a shrine wall by cultists. His mouth went dry. "Captain," he whispered, gesturing Severin over. "Look." Severin's eyes narrowed at the bloody star. The patrician-faced officer betrayed a flicker of alarm. That is no pirate's mark." He traced one of the 8 angled arrows with his flashlight. "By the throne, I fear we know our foe." Trooper Gren shuffled behind them, rifle barrel wavering. Sergeant, there's no sign of Keeper Holden. Emperor's mercy is that all of him?" He eyed the severed arm on the deck, voice quavering. Holt bent and picked up something near the limb. A dented ident tag, sticky with blood. The name M. Holden was etched on it. He closed his fist around the tag, throat tight. There was no body, but enough blood to presume the worst. Of Marek, his old friend. Likely only that arm remained. Thomas made the sign of the Aquila over his chest, lips moving in a silent prayer. From outside, Trooper Markin's voice called uneasily, "Sir, you'll want to see this." Holt and Severin emerged onto the platform, careful not to slip on the wet metal. Markin was pointing upward, toward the beacon's skeletal mast above. Something pale flapped there in the breeze, impaled on the antenna like a grotesque pennant. Holt squinted, raising the lantern. When lightning flashed again, a collective gasp rose from the group. A human skin. It had been stretched and hung from the mast, arms and legs pinned out in an obscene imitation of the imperial Aquila. Rain dripped from its ragged edges. Even from below, Holt could discern crude stitching holding it spread, and tattered scraps of a grey uniform clinging to it. The remains of poor Halden had been turned into a ghoulish display. Trooper Gren doubled over and vomited over the railing. Thomas stumbled back, tears in his eyes as he stared up at the skyward horror. Marken crossed himself and muttered, "God Emperor preserve us." Severin's face had gone ashen, but he forced an icy control into his voice. Eyes sharp. Whoever did this may have left traps or still be nearby. He tapped the bead communicator in his ear. "Lieutenant Janus, come in. Over." A burst of static, then a tinny voice. "Janus here, Captain. Go ahead." The lieutenant had remained on the main island, with reinforcements on standby. Severin took a steadying breath. "Theta Delta beacon secure. Keeper Halden is deceased, violently. Heavy damage to Theta Delta beacon suggests involvement of traitor Astartes. Repeat, possible Chaos Space Marine presence. We are proceeding with extreme caution. Request immediate alert to Colonial Defense Forces. Raise the perimeter and get Bastion Command on the horn. Over." There was a stunned pause before Janus replied. "Understood. Emperor's throne, Captain, did you say?" "Just do it, Janus." Severin snapped, not unkindly. "Await further updates. Severin out." He lowered his hand and met Holt's gaze with grim affirmation. The colony must be warned immediately. If even one of the arch-enemy's Marines is loose here, we have a nightmare on our hands. Emperor knows how many there could be. Holt's mind churned as he tried to make sense of it. What possible reason could such monsters have to come to this waterlogged colony? There was nothing here but fish and fog. Terror for terror's sake. The thought chilled him, that his world might have been chosen simply as a canvas for cruelty. He forced the question aside. Survival first, understanding later. "We need to get back. Now," Holt said firmly. He turned to Thomas and squeezed the boy's shoulder. "You holding up, son?" Thomas nodded shakily, wiping rain and tears from his face. "Aye, Captain." His youthful features were hardening in shock. I can't believe... Why would anyone do that?" He gestured weakly at the gruesome beacon-top display. "To scare us," Holt answered quietly. "To make us afraid before they strike." Marken, still guarding the stair, muttered under his breath, "It's working." His voice trembled despite the dark humor. Captain Severin squared his shoulders, finding strength in duty. "We have a job, troopers. We'll mourn Halden later. Right now the colony must be made ready." He turned on his heel. "Form up, tight formation. Holt, lead us back to the boat." They descended the slippery steps in tense silence, weapons scanning every shadow. The storm was easing into a cold drizzle, but the sky remained a pewter sheet. As they reached the bottom, Holt noticed something new. A second small craft now bumped against the dock opposite the Grace. It was Holden's maintenance dinghy, still tied to its mooring. The little boat was empty, half swamped with rainwater. The fact it was here meant Halden hadn't tried to flee, or hadn't had the chance. The horror had come upon him too fast. Holt clenched his fists, grief and anger swirling inside him. Focus. He had to get these people back alive. The group hurried along the narrow pier toward the trawler. Holt's boots splashed through puddles as he scanned the crashing waves around them. No sign of any attackers, but his skin crawled as if unseen eyes were watching from the fog. They clambered aboard the Miral's Grace. Holt went straight to the wheelhouse and primed the engines. The deck vibrated underfoot as the vessel's Promethium-fueled engines rumbled to life. Thomas cast off the lines with practiced speed, while Severin and his troopers took up guard positions near the bow, peering out into the mist with weapons raised. Thrusters engaged, Holt muttered to himself, spinning the wheel and opening the throttle. Come on, girl, turn. The trawler groaned as it began to swing away from the atoll's rocky edge. A gust of wind shoved at them, threatening to push the hull dangerously close to a cluster of fanged shoals. But Holt compensated. The old engine growled against the current and pulled them into open water. Thomas climbed into the wheelhouse, dripping wet and pale-faced. Course set, Captain. Holt nodded, eyes forward. Due northwest, back to Breaker's Point. Straight run. Emperor willing, we'll be home before midday. Thomas exhaled and glanced over his shoulder toward the receding beacon. Only the faint silhouette of the tower remained, and the nagging image of their friend's skin fluttering on its mast. Those soldiers back there, do they really think it was traitor space marines? His voice was hushed, as if saying it loud might summon them. Holt gripped the wheel tighter. He didn't want to answer, but the boy deserved the truth. Aye, the evidence is there. Emperor, help us. We may be dealing with the worst kind of traitors. He had never encountered such beings, but he'd overheard enough whispered barracks talk. Superhuman giants who descended on the weak and unprepared, reveling in slaughter and fear, leaving only destruction in their wake. Holt felt a queasy dread. What chance did a handful of farmers and fishermen have against such horror? Thomas bit his lip. What do we do? We're just regular folk. Why would Marines come here at all? There's nothing special on Katusa. I don't know, lad, Holt replied quietly. Perhaps because we are easy prey. He immediately regretted his bluntness as Thomas blanched. Softening his tone, he added, but we'll give them a damn tough fight if they try anything. Monsters or not, we're not helpless. The young man nodded, trying to summon courage. Right. We have the PDF and the militia volunteers. If they attacked the beacon at night, maybe they left right after. Maybe, Holt said, forcing an optimism he didn't feel. Pirate raids usually hit and run. Could be they've done their damage and cleared out. Even as he said it, he doubted it. Something about the bloody drama at the tower felt like a prologue, not a finale. He flicked on the ship's short-range vox to listen for any signals from the colony, mostly static, until Severin's voice crackled through. Urgent. Commotion on deck. Immediate support. Holt's eyes widened. He snatched up his las carbine. Severin, say again. A sharp clang reverberated from the starboard side of the hull, cutting off any reply. The whole boat shuddered. Holt burst out of the wheelhouse with Thomas at his heels. On deck, Trooper Marken was down on one knee near the bow, training his rifle toward the stern. Gren was sidling along the port rail, lasgun shaking in his hands as he peered overboard. Severin stood amidships, pistol drawn, eyes sweeping the grey waves around them. Holt's boots thudded on the wet planks. Report, he barked. Marken answered without looking back. Something hit the hull, hard, starboard aft. Thought I saw a shape slip into the water. His face was taut with fear. Holt moved toward the stern, weapon raised. Thomas followed, clutching a steel pry bar as a makeshift club. Rain pattered on the deck and dripped from the rigging. The engine's thrum and the splash of waves were the only sounds. Nothing stirred in the water around them. Holt felt a bead of cold sweat roll down his temple. Had fear and fog gotten the better of their imaginations? A loud bang reverberated from the starboard side, below the waterline. The boat rocked. Gren yelped and stumbled back from the rail as something scraped along the hull with a hideous metallic screech. "Something's down there!" he shouted. Holt dashed to the starboard side and leaned over. Las carbine aimed downward. Salt spray misted his face. For an instant, beneath the surface, he thought he saw a dark blur move. Then a powerful impact slammed into the hull again. This time, wood splinters flew as a section of the stern gunwale exploded upward. With a terrific crash, a portion of the railing was ripped clean away by an unseen force and dragged into the sea. Marken cursed. "Emperor, save us! It's on the hull!" Before Holt could react, the starboard aft deck burst open in an eruption of wood and spray. A massive shape hurtled out of the ocean, landing on the deck with a weighty crash that shook the entire trawler. Holt staggered, staring in disbelief. It was one of them. Midnight blue plate armor streamed with brine, hooked lightning claws extended from each gauntlet. The giant had vaulted over the railing from the water, and now stood among them like a vision from mankind's darkest nightmares. Crimson eye lenses blazed from a skull-faced helm trimmed in cruel brass. Ragged strips of human skin hung from its shoulder guards like macabre tassels. One still bore the pattern of a beacon keeper's uniform. Trooper Gren shrieked and opened fire wildly. His first lashbolt went wide, sizzling past the intruder's helm. In a blur of motion, the traitor lunged. Clawed lightning talons slashed out, catching Gren across the midsection. For an awful second, the young man stood rigid, eyes bulging, as 3 sizzling cuts appeared through his flak vest. Then his torso slid apart with a wet rip. Gren collapsed in 2 pieces, blood and viscera spilling across the deck. Thomas cried out in terror. Holt felt a surge of adrenal fury obliterate his hesitation. "Light him up," he bellowed, snapping his las carbine to his shoulder and firing on full auto. The deck strobe lit with flashes as coherent light lanced out, stitching the giant's torso with a flurry of impacts. Marken joined in, his own lasgun spitting furious red darts into the enemy. The traitor staggered back a half step under the hail. A distorted snarl rasped from his vox speaker. Scorch marks blackened his ceramite armor, where multiple shots struck home, but none penetrated. With unnerving calm, the Chaos Marine raised his heavy pistol and squeezed off 2 rounds in reply. The retorts were ear-splitting in the open air. Marken's upper body vanished in a burst of blood and shrapnel. A mass-reactive bolt round detonated squarely in his chest, leaving nothing above the waist. A second bolt screamed past Holt's cheek and blew apart the wheelhouse door behind him, blasting it into a cloud of splinters. Holt threw himself behind a coil of thick rope as the traitor turned toward the stern, where Severin and Thomas were taking cover near the ladder to the upper deck. Severin fired his last pistol in disciplined double taps, likely aiming for the eye lenses. The armored giant barely flinched, advancing with murderous intent. Thomas had frozen in shock at the butchery of Gren and Marken. Severin grabbed the boy by the back of his coat and hauled him behind a metal storage crate. "Stay down," the captain snapped. The Chaos Marine moved to finish them, but Holt wasn't about to let that happen. Gritting his teeth, he snatched up something at his feet, one of the harpoon spears, a meter-long steel shaft with a wicked barbed tip used in the trawler's fishing gun. With a raw shout, he charged from cover and hurled it with every ounce of strength. For an instant, fortune favored the bold. The makeshift javelin whistled through the rain and punched into the traitor's side, slipping between armor plates at the left armpit. The barbed tip sank deep, and dark, viscous blood spurted out as it bit into flesh beneath. The nightmarish warrior snarled in what might have been pain or fury. Holt's heart leapt. "Captain, now!" Holt roared. "Frag him!" Captain Severin wasted no time. From his belt, he yanked a cylindrical grenade, thumbed the activator, and lobbed it at the giant's feet. Holt barely had time to duck back behind the capstan and clap hands over his ears. The frag grenade erupted with a cone of fire and shrapnel. The blast wave knocked Holt flat against the wet deck. Ears ringing, he looked up to see the Chaos Marine blown back against the port railing. Smoke swirled from dozens of pockmarks in the traitor's armor, where metal fragments had peppered him. One of his helmet's red eye lenses was shattered, revealing a glimpse of a hateful, inhuman eye beneath. The harpoon spear still jutted from under his arm, dark fluid leaking around it. The giant was clearly wounded, but far from dead. With a guttural roar, the Chaos Marine raised his bolter again and fired wildly toward the wheelhouse where Severin and Thomas sheltered. Heavy shells tore through the thin metal walls of the cabin. One round detonated on the navigation console in a spray of sparks. Another blew out the front windows entirely. Severin and Thomas dove apart just in time, fragments of glass scoring their arms and faces. Holt realized their small advantage was evaporating. The traitor's armor was formidable, but the harpoon remained impaled in a weak spot, perhaps puncturing a lung if the Emperor willed it. If I can press that advantage. He darted a look toward the stern. The Grace's heavy anchor winch was mounted there, a rusty but powerful mechanism for hauling nets and anchors. A desperate plan formed in his mind. Holt dropped to all fours and scrambled toward the winch controls, keeping as low as possible behind the cover of the gunwale. The Chaos Marine was focused on Severin's position, stalking that way with thunderous steps, his lightning claws carving gashes in the deck planks as he advanced past the remains of Marken and Gren. Holt reached the winch and silently thanked the Emperor that its power line was still intact after the grenade blast. He yanked the lever marked manual release. With a shriek of gears, the heavy anchor, a multi-pronged metal hook used to stabilize the trawler in strong currents, detached from its clamp and swung free on its chain. The chain began unspooling rapidly from the drum, the thick links clattering loudly as the anchor's weight pulled them overboard. Holt gripped the adjacent engagement lever, waiting, praying his timing would be right. The clatter of the chain drew the nightmarish warrior's attention. He paused and cocked his helmet toward the stern. Holt saw his chance. He rammed the engaged lever forward and locked it. The winch motor roared and caught the spinning chain, arresting it with an abrupt jolt. The anchor's momentum now yanked the chain taut with a violent whip crack. Just as Holt hoped, it lashed across the deck behind the traitor like a striking steel serpent. With a tremendous clang, the heavy chain looped around the Chaos Marine's lower legs, snaring him. The giant growled, trying to lunge forward. The chain had wrapped tight around his greaves, and its attached anchor was now dragging in the sea off the port side, the weight of it pulling relentlessly. Holt didn't hesitate. He slapped the winch motor to retract and jammed it to full power. Gears screamed. The anchor chain went taut and began reeling in. The traitor, entangled and off balance, was abruptly yanked off his feet. With a splash and a furious curse, he toppled over the gunwale and into the ocean, still ensnared by the chain now half submerging him. "Now, Thomas, cut it loose," Holt bellowed, already rushing to help. The young deckhand, eyes wide at the sudden reversal, shook off his stupor. He jumped to the chain release lever and slammed it down. Instantly, the winch's brake disengaged. The chain thundered out freely, sending the heavy anchor and the entangled enemy plummeting into the depths below the boat. The hulking form thrashed once at the surface, a gauntleted hand clawing at empty air. And then he was gone, yanked underwater by the massive weight. Bubbles and froth churned where he disappeared. For a long moment, the only sounds were the survivors' ragged breathing and the rain on the deck. Holt realized he'd been holding his breath. He let it out shakily, las carbines still trained on the foamy water. They waited, but nothing emerged from below. Only a few tendrils of dark blood swirled up where the traitor had sunk. Perhaps from the harpoon wound, perhaps not. Holt didn't care what caused it, only dared to hope the damage had been enough to drown even him. Captain Severin staggered out from cover, one arm pressed to a shrapnel cut on his shoulder. Thomas joined Holt at the rail, peering into the choppy sea. There was nothing to see now. The chain rattled and slackened as it finished unspooling to its full 50-meter length, the loose end disappearing beneath the waves. Far below, there was a faint metallic groan as the anchor lightly hit the seabed. We got him," Thomas whispered, hardly believing. Holt kept his weapon trained a few moments longer. The surface revealed nothing save that spreading stain of ichor. At last, he lowered his las carbine and placed a hand on Thomas's arm. "Aye, by the throne, I think we sent that bastard to the depths." He tried to keep his tone steady, though his heart was hammering so fiercely he felt lightheaded. Severin approached, gently kicking aside Gren's severed lower half as he came. His face was drawn but determined. "Are either of you hurt?" "Fine," Holt grunted, though he felt a dozen cuts and one shallow bolt fragment lodged in his thigh, bleeding warm through his trouser leg. Adrenaline still masked the pain. Thomas had a superficial gash on his forehead and some burns on his hands from grabbing the hot chain, but he waved it off. "We lost Marken and Gren," Thomas said numbly, looking over the gore slicking the deck. The rain was already washing streams of crimson toward the scuppers. Severin closed his eyes briefly. "The Emperor knows their sacrifice," he murmured. He turned to Holt, expression grim but carrying a newfound respect. "Sergeant Holt, Varren. Throne above. That was quick thinking. You lightly saved us all." Holt shook his head. "It was a gamble. Could just as easily have gotten us killed." He glanced at the choppy water where the traitor had vanished. "We were lucky." The captain allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Luck and a good measure of courage. His gaze drifted to the roiling sea. "If that monster truly drowned, I'll take it. One less to worry about." Holt gave a weary nod. He cast his eyes toward the northwest, where the dark shape of the main island lay hidden in mist. One of them down. Emperor knows how many more to go. It felt far too early to celebrate. These weren't foes likely to travel alone, and even if the traitor they'd sunk was solitary. Holt doubted the warband that killed Halden consisted of only one warrior. Thomas seemed to have the same thought. He leaned on the rail, drenched and shaking. If one was here, there may be others. Emperor, could that have been the same one who butchered the beacon? "Could be," Holt answered, clapping the boy's shoulder gently. "If so, he's paid for it." Severin's expression remained hard. "One down. We must assume more remain. Our mission hasn't changed. Warn the colony. They need to know what's coming, what's already here." He looked at what remained of his two troopers with pained eyes, then squared his shoulders. "Let's get moving. We're exposed out here." They worked quickly under the drizzle. Thomas fetched tarps to cover what was left of Marken and Gren, his hands shaking only slightly as he helped Holt lay their fallen comrades as respectfully as possible. Holt pried Gren's dog tags from the half of his torso they could find and slipped them into a pocket next to Halden's tag. "I'll see these returned to their families," he vowed silently. Severin ducked into the wheelhouse and tried to raise harbor command on the Vox. Holt heard only static and the captain's frustrated curses. "No good. The long-range set's fried from that bolt hit," Severin reported, glancing at the shattered Voxcaster unit. "We'll have to warn them in person." Holt nodded grimly. He carefully eased the Grace back on course, throttling the engines up. The trawler groaned but responded, swinging around to the northwest. A fine vibration ran through the deck from the damage they'd sustained, but she would hold together. Holt had built this boat tougher than he was. Thomas lingered at the stern for a moment, staring at the slack anchor chain drifting behind them. "I'll cut the chain loose, Cap," he offered weakly. "We can forge a new one later. Better not to tow that." Holt grunted assent. Indeed, he had no desire to drag the presumably drowned traitor's corpse behind them like some cursed catch. With effort, Thomas engaged the emergency release. The entire chain rumbled off the drum and slid away, disappearing into the Grace's bubbling wake to join the anchor and its grim prize at the bottom of the sea. The rain finally began to ease as they pushed onward. Breakers Point's outline became visible ahead as a dark ribbon of land. The storm clouds were beginning to thin. Fitful fingers of sunlight poked through here and there over distant waves. It might have seemed a hopeful sign on any other day, but Holt's heart sat leaden in his chest. The image of that flayed skin on the beacon and the brutality of the fight replayed over and over in his mind. The worst part was knowing it was only the beginning. Captain Severin stood beside him in the wheelhouse, reloading his pistol with hands kept steady by sheer force of will. "How much longer?" he asked quietly. 40 minutes, maybe less," Holt replied, opening the throttle further. The Grace's engines complained, but complied, churning up foamy white behind them as speed increased. He glanced at Severin. "What's our plan once we arrive?" Severin's jaw set. "First, gather every able-bodied fighter. We'll sound the emergency alarm. That should rally volunteers and off-duty PDF. I have to assume communications might be targeted if the enemy really means to cripple us. We should secure the Vox relay and astropath, then fortify key locations." Holt nodded grimly. If he were an arch-traitor bent on terrorizing a colony, he'd isolate it by taking out comms and transport first, and their foe had already begun to do exactly that. "The governor must be alerted and any Arbites on planet," he added. "The governor..." Severin grimaced. "Frankly, Administrator Connell isn't the most decisive man, but he'll do what the PDF command tells him, Emperor willing. As for Arbites, we've only one officer in Breakers Point, Old Marshal Olin. I'll take whatever help we can get, though he's more used to dealing with bar brawls and poachers than Chaos Marines." "Then we lean on those who've seen combat," Holt said. His mind was already ticking through who that included. The colony was young, but among a few thousand settlers, there were bound to be some Imperial Guard veterans, maybe even a retired commissar if luck smiled. Holt himself, Severin, perhaps one or two others would have to anchor the defense with their experience. Thomas stood in the doorway listening quietly. The young man's face was pale but resolute. He had picked up Marken's lasgun, amazingly intact, and now held it at his side, clearly intent on keeping it. Holt wondered if the boy even realized the flecks of someone else's blood speckling his cheeks. Holt felt a surge of fierce pride and sorrow, seeing Thomas robbed of his youthful innocence in a single morning. The harbor neared. They could make out the breakwater and piers, the cluster of low buildings beyond. To Holt's surprise, a small crowd had gathered at the main quay, pointing toward the incoming trawler. Word must have spread that something was wrong. Likely Harbour Master Luron had noticed the missed check-ins, or sentries spotted smoke from the beacon or the exchange on the water. As the Miral's Grace pulled into port, Holt saw Luron himself among those waiting, alongside a couple of Connell's Administratum deputies and a squad of PDF troopers. All stood tensely by the pier. Holt expertly brought the vessel alongside with minimal bumping, and Thomas looped a rope over a bollard to secure them. Even before they finished tying off, Luron hailed them, voice strained. "Captain Holt, thank the throne you're back. We feared the worst when you didn't respond. What happened out?" His eyes drifted past Holt, widening at the bullet-riddled wheelhouse and the tarpaulin-draped shapes on deck. The crowd behind him murmured in alarm. Holt stepped onto the gunwale of his boat. "Get me a loud hailer, Luron," he barked, voice carrying across the suddenly hushed wharf. "And fetch Marshal Olin and Governor Connell immediately." We have an emergency on our hands. Luron blanched but nodded vigorously. He hurried off, shouting at a dockhand to bring the colony's brass Vox loudspeaker. Captain Severin disembarked right behind Holt and began issuing orders to a PDF sergeant waiting on the pier. Secure this dock. No one leaves the area. There may be enemies about. And get stretcher bearers for the casualties on that boat, he added more softly, with a nod back toward the tarps covering his fallen troopers. Within minutes, a clanging peal began ringing from the bell tower in the town center. The colony's emergency alarm. Its brassy, repetitive knell hadn't sounded in years, not since a typhoon threatened to flood the settlement in its first year. But now it told a dire warning that every colonist would understand in their bones. The sleepy fishing port stirred like an anthill kicked over. Shouts rose in the distance as people looked about in confusion or hurried toward pre-assigned muster points. Luron returned with a large Vox hailer. Holt grabbed it and climbed atop a stack of crates on the dock to be seen above the growing crowd. He depressed the transmit rune and spoke, voice amplified into a booming timbre that echoed off the nearby storehouses. "People of Breaker's Point, hear me," he announced. The panicked movement stilled somewhat as dozens of faces turned toward him. They all knew Captain Holt, the gruff but reliable fisherman who'd been among the first wave of settlers. "An attack has occurred," Holt continued, "out at Theta Delta Beacon. The beacon is down, and the threat is real and present. We believe traitor Space Marines, servants of chaos, are responsible." A gasp rippled through the gathering crowd. Already a few hundred had assembled, many still in aprons or clutching tools from their interrupted morning tasks. Holt saw fear bloom on their faces at the words, "traitor Space Marines." Some looked incredulous, others on the verge of panic. He held up his free hand high. "Listen now. We engaged one of the traitors at sea and drove it off, but more may be on their way, or already here in hiding." That set off a wave of anxious murmurs. Holt pressed on loudly. "I know you're afraid, but if we stand together, we can survive whatever terror they mean to inflict. We must arm ourselves and secure the town. I need every able soul, PDF, militia, dock worker, whoever can carry a weapon, to rally at the Administratum Square immediately. Form squads and watch each other's backs." He locked eyes with a group of brawny fishermen he knew well. "John, Marwi, get your crews to patrol along the shoreline. Look for any boats or anyone coming out of the surf where they shouldn't. We might catch the enemy trying to sneak in." The men nodded and broke off into action, grateful for orders to follow. Marshal Olin arrived then, strapping a flak vest over his Arbeits uniform and accompanied by 2 deputy arbitrators armed with combat shotguns. The grizzled lawman gave Holt a firm nod from the edge of the crowd. Governor Connell also appeared, flanked by nervous-looking aides with data slates. The portly administrator was sweating and wringing his hands. Holt wasted no time. He thrust the loud hailer toward the governor. "Sir, with respect, let Captain Severin and Marshal Olin take charge of the defense. Approve whatever measures they need. Lives are at stake." Connell, who had likely never faced more than a heated budget meeting, nodded vigorously. Yes, of course. Whatever is needed, do it," he babbled, backing away to let the military men handle it. Captain Severin took the loud hailer next and began organizing the PDF units, now arriving at a jog. "Perimeter teams to the town's edge. Set up heavy stubbers covering the main roadways and the shoreline approaches. Funnel any attackers into crossfires. Marshal Olin, coordinate with the militia." Olin barked assent and immediately set about stationing his arbitrators and deputized locals at key junctions. Holt jumped down from the crate a wave of exhaustion threatening to buckle his knees now that the adrenaline of command was ebbing. Tomas was at his side in an instant, steadying him. "I'm all right," Holt murmured, though his head swam. The morning's horrors were catching up, but he refused to succumb now. The boy, no, the young man, Holt corrected, searched his eyes. "What can I do, Captain?" Holt managed a small, grim smile. "Stay with me. We'll join the eastern perimeter patrol. I have a feeling these devils might come from that side, if only because that's where the fog lies thickest." Inland, mists were rolling heavily off the marsh flats, a grey shroud creeping toward town. Tomas gripped the lasgun he'd claimed and nodded. "Aye, by your side then." As Holt loaded a fresh power pack into his las carbine, he realized his hands were sticky. He glanced down to see them still stained with partially dried blood, some his own from cuts, most belonging to others. He wiped them on a rag, swallowing the lump in his throat. There would be time to grieve later, he promised himself, if they survived this day. Captain Severin returned to them, offering Holt a firm clasp on the shoulder. "The defense is shaping up. You did well out there, Holt." He gestured to Holt's thigh, where the bolt fragment had torn his pant leg and left a nasty bleeding groove. "Now get that wound seen to." Holt had honestly forgotten the injury in the flurry of activity. Now that it was pointed out, a hot throb of pain started to pulse through his leg. "It'll hold," he said through grit teeth. "We've work yet." Severin didn't argue, simply nodding in respect. "Just don't go fainting on me, old man." In another context, it might have been a joke. Here it was more like a plea. A distant boom suddenly echoed from across the harbor. Everyone on the quay froze. Holt whipped his head toward the sound. It had come from the direction of the power station at the town's edge. Almost immediately, a low vibration rippled through the ground. Then, one by one, the street lamps sputtered and went dark. The entire settlement's electric grid died in an instant, plunging many interiors into dimness. A collective gasp of alarm rose from the townsfolk. "They've hit the generator!" someone shouted. Holt felt his heart clamp tight. It was midday, so the loss of lights wasn't crippling in itself, but it meant the enemy was already striking at infrastructure. The main power station, a small promethium-fueled plant on the outskirts, was lightly guarded, if guarded at all. Severin spat a curse. They must have slipped a team in or planted charges last night. Before Holt could reply, a new sound drifted through the unsettled air. A crackle of broken Vox static, then disjointed words blared from the colony's public address speakers. The voice was distorted, over-amplified, dripping with icy malice.
"People of Cortusa, we are here, watching, waiting."
Holt's blood turned to ice. The voice echoed from multiple loudhailers around town. The enemy had hijacked the public VoxNet. Perhaps the power outage allowed them to override it on backup batteries. The voice was deep, unnatural. Half a growl, half a sneer.
"Your protectors cannot save you,"
it taunted, laced with cruel amusement. In the background of the transmission came faint sounds, the warbling cacophony of either screams or laughter.
"Where will you hide when the darkness comes? Night falls, and we have come for you."
At those words, Holt saw several townsfolk recoil in pure terror. They felt like tendrils of death curling into the heart. Governor Connell looked ready to collapse entirely, knees shaking. Marshal Olin bellowed over the speakers, "Steady! Stand to your posts!" His authoritative bark helped. The PDF and militia steeled themselves, many muttering prayers even as they gripped their weapons tighter instead of dropping them. Holt exchanged a tense look with Severin. The enemy was playing their game, trying to break morale with ominous broadcasts and sabotage. But aside from the one Holt's crew encountered, the attackers had yet to show themselves openly. That meant they likely intended a sudden, devastating strike once fear had peaked. "Captain, any word from Fort Starburn?" Holt asked, referring to a small Imperial listening post on the far side of the island. Perhaps they could call for help. Severin shook his head grimly. "No. The astropathic choir is silent too. Possibly hit at the same time as the power. We have to assume we're on our own for now." He looked around at the defenders, dispersing to their positions around town. Perhaps 150 armed souls in total, between PDF and militia, against Emperor knew how many nightmarish invaders. But we'll give them a fight to remember. Holt hefted his las carbine and took up position with a group of militia behind an overturned wagon, forming a makeshift barricade on the eastern approach road. Tomas crouched next to him, jaw set in determination, despite the tremor in his hands. Holt wished he could better reassure the lad, but managed a tight, encouraging nod. Truthfully, his own heart was thundering in his chest. He whispered a litany under his breath. "Though the darkness surrounds us, we shall not fear. The God Emperor is our light and salvation." Tomas added softly, "The Emperor protects." Others around them murmured similar prayers, drawing what courage they could. They didn't have to wait long. From the distant tree line beyond the eastern fields, movement flickered. A ripple of darkness separate from the shadows. Then multiple shapes bounding forward with alarming speed. "There! Contact front!" Holt shouted. He opened fire and so did the others. Red las bolts lanced out, searing through the damp air. In the brush, something screeched inhumanly as a shot struck it full in the chest. A militiaman whooped in triumph, but a moment later, a return volley answered. The distinctive boom of bolt guns erupted, and the wagon Holt sheltered behind disintegrated as explosive rounds blew it apart. "Down!" Holt roared, dragging Tomas flat as a bolt whizzed overhead and detonated against a brick wall behind them, showering rubble and dust. Another nearby militiaman wasn't so lucky. 1 second he was firing from cover, the next a bolt shell burst him into a red mist. Now the attackers charged in full. Holt glimpsed 6 armored figures rushing from the tree line. They moved with terrifying grace for being so massive. 2 had bulky contraptions on their backs, jump packs. And even as he spotted them, those 2 ignited their thrusters and launched into the sky, arcing toward the heart of town with trails of fire. They would land behind their lines, if not stopped. "Target the flyers," Holt ordered, snapping off shots at one streaking overhead. A few las hits sparked off the Marine's armor, but it kept on, vanishing behind a row of habs toward the town center. A heavy stubber team in a sandbag nest opened up, tracers stitching across the gray sky to chase the second jumper. The staccato gunfire chewed into its target. One of the jump pack's thrusters sputtered. With an ear-splitting crash, the traitor spun out of control and slammed into the bell tower structure near the town square. The impact shook the tower and sent the brass alarm bell clanging chaotically. A ragged cheer went up from nearby militia. Short-lived, as an answering hail of bolter fire from the remaining ground attackers forced everyone back into cover. Holt grit his teeth. They had scored small early victories, but the real fight was now upon them. The 4 remaining Chaos Marines on the ground advanced methodically, firing as they came. Despite the defenders' desperate return fire, the giants weathered the las bolts and shotgun blasts with little sign of slowing. Holt focused his aim on one whose helmet was missing, knocked off by a lucky hit, or perhaps he had removed it to better smell the fear. The traitor's exposed face was deathly pale, a rictus grin of filed teeth stretching across his mouth. Holt felt fury cut through his terror. These monsters would not take his home without paying dearly. He steadied his aim, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. A lasbolt lanced out and struck the bare-headed Marine in the left eye, bursting it in an ugly spray of gore. The traitor howled and staggered, slapping a clawed hand over the sizzling empty socket. "Throne, you got him!" Thomas exulted. Holt didn't have time to celebrate. A different armored giant, this one armed with a crackling power axe, suddenly broke from the pack and charged their barricade directly, intent on silencing Holt's accurate fire. "Back! Fall back!" Holt shouted. He grabbed Thomas by the collar and yanked him away an instant before the power axe cleaved down, splitting the ground where they'd knelt and carving a smoking furrow through planks and earth. The militia fighters scattered. Holt and Thomas sprinted around a corner as the axe-wielding giant raged behind them. This was devolving into brutal, close-quarters fighting, exactly what the enemy wanted. He whirled to see Captain Severin being set upon by the axe-wielding traitor who had flanked their position. The giant backhanded Severin's pistol aside and smashed the captain with his free fist, sending Severin crashing through a wooden porch railing. The officer hit the ground hard and lay motionless. With a guttural chuckle, the axe-wielder raised his crackling weapon high to finish Severin off, only to snarl as Holt emptied a full lass burst into his back. "Over here, scum!" Holt roared, trying to draw the monster away. It worked. The Chaos Marine turned his horned helm toward Holt, forgetting the prone Severin. The traitor's eye lenses glowed with hate as he stalked toward Holt, massive axe humming as it carved the air. Holt fired shot after shot into him, but the giant kept coming relentlessly. "Thomas, run!" Holt ordered, unwilling to see the boy slaughtered. Perhaps Thomas didn't hear amid the cacophony, or perhaps he refused, for he remained at Holt's side, firing his lasgun frantically. Most of Thomas's shots splashed harmlessly off the foe's thick pauldrons. The nightmarish warrior closed the distance in seconds. Holt's las carbine clicked empty. With no time to reload, he unslung it and gripped it like a club, a pitiful weapon against a superhuman foe. But it was all he had. The power axe swung in a lethal horizontal arc. Holt shoved Thomas aside at the last second, as the blade whooshed past, shearing clean through the wall of a shed beside them. Seizing the moment, Holt lunged low and drove his shoulder into the Marine's midsection, trying to topple him as he'd done with the anchor chain on the boat. Nothing. The Chaos Marine did not fall, and recovered with frightening speed from his missed attack, slamming an elbow down onto Holt's back. Something crunched in Holt's ribs as he was driven to his knees, gasping. The traitor seized Holt by the throat with one hand and lifted him like a rag doll. Holt gagged, boots dangling above the ground, iron fingers choking the life from him. The massive axe rose, its blade humming, ready to split Holt in two. A lasbolt suddenly smacked into the side of the traitor's helm, scorching a black line across it. "Let him go!" Thomas screamed, firing again and again as he advanced on the giant's flank. Snarling, the Chaos Marine twisted and hurled Holt's body at the oncoming youth. Holt slammed into Thomas and they both went down in a heap. Holt's vision swam with pain and lack of air, his lungs burning. Still he forced himself up, shielding the dazed Thomas with his own body as the armored monster loomed over them. The traitor raised his axe high for the killing blow. Holt met the glowing red eyes behind that skull-faced helm and refused to look away. If this was to be his end, he'd meet it head-on. "Emperor, give me strength," he rasped, bracing for the strike. It never landed. A burst of gunfire from the side tore into the giant, heavy slugs sparking off ceramite. Someone shouted a battle cry. Holt caught a glimpse of Marshal Olin and his two arbitrators, charging from a side alley, shotguns booming. They must have flanked around. One of Olin's deputies emptied both barrels into the Chaos Marine at point-blank range. The blast didn't penetrate the power armor, but spoiled his killing swing. Marshal Olin fired his own shotgun straight up into the traitor's exposed armpit, the same spot Holt had struck with the spear earlier. Snarling, he lashed out with his lightning claw, catching one arbitrator and literally tearing him in half. The other deputy pressed his attack, unloading more shells even as the traitor's axe came about in a murderous arc. Holt seized Thomas by the arm. "Go, fall back," he croaked, voice barely above a whisper after the throttling. The fight was swiftly turning against Olin and his men. Holt knew they needed to retreat and regroup, or all would be lost. Thomas hesitated, unwilling to leave Holt behind, but Holt shoved him firmly toward the nearest alley mouth. "That's an order, boy. Go," he managed, forcing air through his bruised windpipe. Eyes brimming with reluctant tears, Thomas shook his head. "Not without you," and helped Holt to his feet. Supporting the older man, he began half dragging, half carrying him away from the melee. Holt's ribs screamed with each step, and his vision flickered at the edges, but he forced himself onward. Behind them came the sickening crunch of metal on bone, the traitor's axe finding its mark. Marshal Olin's brave assault ended with a wet gurgle and the thud of a body hitting mud. Holt didn't look back. The eastern barricade was lost. All along the street, pockets of militia and PDF were falling back or being overrun. The defenders' ambush had not stopped the enemy. Now the giant warriors prowled among the hab blocks, flushing out anyone who hid and slaughtering those too slow to escape. Isolated gunshots and screams echoed between clapboard houses. The acrid stink of burning promethium and charred flesh hung in the air. Holt and Thomas stumbled through a side street toward the harbor. Around a bend, they nearly collided with a knot of civilians, mostly women and children, huddled behind an overturned fish cart. A few had small arms or kitchen knives, protecting the rest. They looked at Holt's bloodied, bedraggled form, and Thomas supporting him, and despair crept into their eyes. One of the women sobbed, "We're finished. Emperor, save us. We're finished." Holt grimaced against the pain in his chest and forced himself to stand upright, pushing Thomas off to show he could. "Not yet, we aren't," he rasped. He recognized these townsfolk, neighbors he'd shared tables and laughter with. He could not let their spark of hope die. "To the docks," he ordered hoarsely. "If we can get offshore, we have a chance. Move." They moved. Desperate feet splashed through puddles as Holt shepherded the group westward, away from the main streets, now overrun with terror. Others emerged from doorways and alleys to join them, a trickle of panicked survivors converging toward the waterfront. The harbor came into view as they rounded the last row of granaries. The scene there was chaos as well. Several boats had cast off already, overloaded with people and skiffs nearly capsizing as they pushed away from the piers. Holt saw one smaller craft only manage a few dozen meters from shore before a sudden explosion blew it apart in a fireball, likely hit by a missile or grenade from somewhere in town. The enemy wasn't content to let anyone flee easily. Holt ground his teeth. Near the central pier, a crowd pressed, yelling and scrambling to get onto the remaining vessels. One fishing barge was so swamped with people clambering aboard that it rolled, dumping screaming colonists into the harbor. On another pier, PDF Sergeant Janus was waving a pistol, trying to organize a fighting retreat of a few soldiers, while also ushering civilians towards boats. In the distance, the colony's administratum building was belching smoke, flames licking from its upper windows. The invaders were tearing the heart out of Breaker's Point. Thomas gripped Holt's arm. "Captain, your boat!" He pointed further along the quay. There, still moored at Pier 3 where they had left it, was the Miral's Grace. By some luck, it hadn't been commandeered or destroyed yet. Holt's sturdy trawler bobbed intact, looking like salvation itself. A handful of colonists were already on deck, perhaps those he had earlier ordered to patrol the shoreline, or dockhands who knew the vessel. Holt could see the stocky silhouette of John gesturing frantically for more people to get aboard. Holt's ragged group hurried toward the Grace. "All of you, get on that ship," Holt barked. "Move!" He broke into as much of a run as his battered body allowed, ushering the civilians ahead of him up the gangplank that still connected to the pier. Thomas helped a limping elder and 2 children up the ramp. John was on deck, helping pull people aboard. "Captain!" John shouted in relief as Holt reached the foot of the gangplank. "We were about to cast off. Thought you'd been..." He didn't finish the thought. Holt quickly scanned the wharf behind them. More survivors were trickling out from the smoke and fog, drawn by the sight of an organized evacuation. But behind those figures, further up the street, he saw looming armored shapes moving through the haze, coming toward the piers. They had spotted the fleeing civilians. Holt turned to Thomas and clasped his shoulder tightly. "Thomas, get these people out of here. Start the engines and go. Save as many as you can carry." Thomas's eyes widened. "What? No, not without you." Holt managed a sad, proud smile. "That's an order, sailor. I'll be right behind you." It was a lie, and they both knew it. A tear escaped the young man's eye. Holt squeezed his shoulder once more, then practically shoved him up the gangplank. "Go! They need you, Thomas." Captain Severin suddenly limped out of the swirling smoke onto the pier, flanked by 2 PDF troopers. He was bloodied and favoring one leg, but alive. He took in the scene at a glance and yelled to Holt, "We'll hold them here as long as we can. Get everyone aboard." Holt nodded. Severin understood. This pier would be the bottleneck to buy a few more precious minutes. The last of the civilians from Holt's group were scrambling up the ramp now. John had leapt back to the dock to help Severin cover the retreat, hefting a lass rifle likely scavenged from a fallen guard. Thomas hovered at the top of the gangplank, torn. "Captain Holt, please." "Cast off, Thomas," Holt roared with what remained of his voice. "That's an order." Thomas's face twisted in anguish, but he obeyed. He hacked through the mooring line with a knife. On deck, an older fisherman gunned the engine to life. The Miral's Grace began to drift from the pier, turning slowly out toward open water. Several desperate people, still on the dock, made frantic jumps onto the departing boat. Some made it, others splashed into the sea and were hauled aboard by those already safe. Holt allowed himself one last look at Thomas. The boy was leaning over the aft rail, arm outstretched and tears streaking his face as the distance widened. Holt raised his hand in a final salute. He hoped Thomas could see the pride in his eyes. Then Holt turned away, choking down the sorrow that threatened to break him. There was fury and purpose yet to spend. He, Severin, and John would be the last line here. 3 injured men against God knew what nightmares, stalking toward them in the fog. Holt picked up a fallen heavy stubber that one of the PDF teams had abandoned near the pier. With a grunt, he braced the barrel on a crate, and Severin slammed a fresh belt of ammo into its side feed. John checked the charge on his lass rifle and took cover behind a pier piling. Through the drifting smoke, shadows emerged. 3 of the giants, moving steadily down the waterfront street toward Pier 3. 2 bore cruel melee weapons. One was the axe champion again, helmet dented and splattered with gore. Another dragged a wicked chain mace, while the third covered them with a bolter. They saw the small rearguard blocking the pier and came on without hesitation. "Now or never," Holt rasped. "Emperor be with us," Severin muttered. His left arm hung useless at his side, but with his right he raised his last pistol, jaw clenched. At 20 meters, Holt pressed the stubber's trigger and let rip. The heavy weapon thumped and sprayed a cone of tracers. The hail of large caliber rounds slammed into the oncoming Marines. One stumbled a half step as a lucky shot punched through an already damaged knee joint, eliciting a growl. John fired disciplined Lars bursts, aiming for eye lenses and neck seals. The traitors answered with a withering volley. Bolter shells chewed apart the crates and barrels around the defenders. John caught a round in the chest and went down with a strangled cry, blood gushing from a fist-sized exit wound. Severin emptied his pistol and struck one of the giants in the throat. The warrior snarled and staggered, black ichor spilling down his breastplate. But the hulking figure didn't fall. They were too few and too broken to hold for long. Holt's stubber clicked empty. He reached for another belt and realized he had none. With a curse, he drew his las carbine again. Maybe a dozen shots left in the pack. The trio of Chaos Marines closed in relentlessly. The lead one, the axe wielder, tore off his battered skull helm, revealing a hate-twisted face crisscrossed with scars and fresh burns. One eye glowed bionically red. The other socket was empty, the wound Holt had inflicted still oozing. It was the same warrior Holt had fought earlier, eager for revenge.
You!
The traitor snarled, his voice a guttural rasp. He recognized Holt.
I will flay you and offer your screaming soul to the Prince of Darkness.
Holt mustered a bloody grin, raising his las carbine. Come and try, you bastard. With a roar, the Chaos Marine charged, power axe held high. Holt and Severin both opened fire, las bolts scorching into the giant's exposed, deathly pale face. He laughed, actually laughed, as one shot blew off part of his cheek. Another seared a black hole in his forehead. The warped creature felt no pain, or simply didn't care. Behind him, the other two traitors advanced more slowly, content to let their champion finish this last fight up close. At the end, Holt and Severin stood shoulder to shoulder at the mouth of the pier, backlit by the glow of fires devouring their town. Their weapons ran dry together, clicks replacing bolts of energy. It was time. Holt glanced sidelong at Severin. The captain met his gaze, blood running from a cut on his brow, and gave a faint nod. There would be no surrender, no retreat. They would sell their lives here for a few more moments. Moments that might mean survival for those on the Grace. With a defiant shout to the sky, Varon Holt drew his curved boarding knife, and Severin unsheathed his dress sword, pathetic steel blades against 8-foot nightmares. But it didn't matter now. Together they hurled themselves forward to meet the charging foe, in a final act of heedless courage. The Chaos Champion swung his crackling axe in a wide horizontal swipe, meant to cut both men in half. Holt ducked under it with a grunt of effort, ribs screaming. Severin parried with his sword. The blow shattered the weapon and likely his arm, but it deflected the axe's path enough to spare him a killing blow for another second. Severin lunged with the broken hilt, driving the splintered blade up under the traitor's arm. The giant roared in irritation more than pain, and backhanded Severin with his clawed gauntlet, sending the captain sprawling to the blood-slick dock. Holt dashed in, hacking his knife into the gap at the back of the traitor's knee where armor met tendon. The blade bit, drawing a spurt of black blood. With a snarl, the Chaos Marine kicked out, knocking Holt onto his back. The monstrous warrior loomed over Holt, raising his axe for the killing strike. Holt tasted copper in his mouth. He knew he would not evade it this time, but behind the towering figure, out on the dark water, he caught a glimpse of the Miral's Grace. Her running lights were just visible in the mist, growing smaller but still shining. Thomas had gotten them away. They're clear. The traitor's ruined face twisted in rage as he prepared to deliver the death blow. Holt refused to cower. He spat a glob of blood at the Marine's feet and bellowed hoarsely, "For the Emperor!" Before the axe could fall, a thunderous explosion shook the pier. A blossom of fire erupted behind the Chaos Marines as the harbor's Prometheum fuel depot went up in a massive explosion. Severin, crawling, broken but not defeated, had dragged himself to a stack of fuel drums and, with his last strength, thumbed a detonator in his remaining hand. The resulting fireball engulfed all three traitors from behind, a wave of searing heat and concussive force that lifted Holt off the ground and flung him into the harbor waters. Holt felt himself plunge into sudden cold and murky silence. The shockwave dulled his senses. He tumbled beneath the surface, vision darkening. Faintly through the water, he sensed a series of secondary blasts thundering above as munitions cooked off, and then gradually, only ringing emptiness. He broke the surface, gasping, scarcely conscious. Flaming debris rained down on the harbor, hissing as it met water. Through the curtain of smoke, Holt glimpsed the pier, or what remained of it. The section where he and Severin had stood was now a blackened ruin. The Chaos Marines, nowhere to be seen, perhaps blown apart or blasted into the deeps. The entire waterfront was an inferno of burning fuel. Holt's battered body screamed for rest. His limbs felt leaden as he struggled to stay afloat amid choppy waves and floating wreckage. The taste of salt and blood filled his mouth. He knew death was closing in on him, cold arms pulling him down. But through it all, a faint smile crept to his lips. The Miral's grace was gone, escaped into the open sea, carrying the precious spark of the colony's future with her. Tomas and those few souls would live. The enemy had been denied complete victory. Sirens wailed distantly. Holt's head lolled back. The sky above was clearing at last, the storm clouds rent by the explosion's shock. In the open patch of sky, somewhere far away, lay Terra. Holt thought of the God Emperor and of all distant worlds out there. In the end, we held them, just long enough. His strength gave out. As he sank beneath, a twisted, familiar visage appeared above him.
We have come for you.
It grinned widely at him as a steel grip closed around his neck, and Holt grinned back. Far out in the bay, Thomas Dahl stood at the helm of the overloaded Miral's Grace, steering away from the burning harbor with tears streaming down his face. Behind him, dozens of huddled survivors sobbed or stared in shock at the conflagration that had been their home. As the flames on the pier erupted skyward, Thomas let out a keening wail of grief and fury that was lost to the roaring fires and crashing surf. Breaker's Point burned. The night of terror was not yet done, but thanks to the sacrifice of the last defenders on that pier, at least some would live to see the dawn. Report. After-action assessment. Terror raid on Oceanic Colony Cortusa, Breaker's Point settlement. Date 129.776.M41. Compiled by Master Provost Hiram Lux, Adeptus Arbites. Appended to Ordo Hereticus Archives. Summary. On 128.776.M41, a vicious surprise attack was carried out on the colony world Cortusa, designation Oceanic Agri-Colony, by what evidence confirms was a warband of Night Lord's Chaos Space Marines. The assault began with sabotage of outlying infrastructure. Lighthouse beacon Theta Delta destroyed, primary power station demolished, and psychological warfare tactics. Hijacked Voxnet broadcasts, gruesome displays of slaughtered victims, designed to sow terror and confusion rather than seize territory. The enemy's intent was pure terror and butchery. Despite severe initial casualties during the surprise phase, the colonial militia and PDF, supported by armed citizens, mounted a courageous if desperate defense within Breaker's Point, the principal settlement. The colonists, largely unaugmented civilians, resisted with unexpected cohesion, managing to slow the Night Lord's advance at great cost. Enemy forces. Forensic analysis and eyewitness accounts indicate at least 7 Chaos Astartes of the Night Lord's Legion were involved in the raid. No identified enemy losses. The warband, including what is presumed to have been the leader, are unaccounted for, likely withdrawing once their objectives were met or when resistance stiffened. No off-world extraction vessel signatures were detected, suggesting the surviving traitors may have gone to ground or departed via stealth means. Notable enemy hallmarks included classic 8th Legion terror tactics, flaying of victims, Beacon Keeper Holden's skin discovered displayed, distortion of Vox communications with taunts, and use of jump pack Raptor units for rapid shock assaults. Enemy iconography observed on site, the 8-pointed Chaos Star drawn in blood, winged skull insignia on armor, corroborates Night Lord's affiliation beyond doubt. Intercepted Vox chatter included fragments of the war cry, Ave Dominus Nox, Hail the Lord of Night, and the phrase, We have come for you. Repeated on loop, signatures of the Night Lord's modus operandi. Friendly forces and key actors. The colony's defense was improvised under PDF Captain Arlen Severin and acting militia leader Varen Holt, formerly PDF Sergeant, local fisherman. Both men are credited with extraordinary leadership and valor in the face of overwhelming odds. Tragically, both were killed, Captain Severin in action during the final defense of the harbor, and Varen Holt later succumbed to being flayed alive after surviving the explosion, initiated to delay the enemy and allow civilian evacuees, approximately 70 individuals, to escape by sea. Surviving militia and civilian reports repeatedly cite Holt's tactical acumen and Severin's steadfast courage as pivotal in saving lives. Notable civilian contributors include Thomas Dahl, dock worker, age 19. Dahl assisted Holt throughout several close engagements and ultimately piloted the escape vessel that carried survivors to safety. Marshal Olin also led several counterattacks that temporarily stalled the enemy, though he was later confirmed KIA. Outcome: enemy raid concluded with partial success. Breaker's Point suffered heavy loss of life and significant structural damage, around 40% of buildings damaged or burned. However, the enemy did not achieve full extermination of the colony. Thanks to the delaying actions of the defenders, roughly 300 survivors, including those at sea and those who hid inland, lived through the ordeal. The Night Lord's warband, having sown terror and taken their grisly trophies, likely withdrew before dawn to avoid interception, once it became clear some colonists had escaped to raise alarm. Off-world communications were restored via auxiliary astropath within 16 hours post-attack. A Segmentum Navy patrol frigate, Righteous Vigil, arrived 72 hours later in response to distress signals. Search teams and an attachment of Imperial Fist's Space Marines, 3rd Company, have since been deployed to hunt down any remaining Night Lords on Cortusa or nearby systems, none found to date. Breaker's Point survivors have been evacuated to the planet's secondary outpost for trauma care, and the settlement will require extensive rebuilding. Evidence and analysis. Wreckage of a small Chaos drop shuttle was found submerged near Beacon Theta Delta, presumably scuttled by the attackers to conceal their approach. Its damaged Vox log, once decrypted, continuously transmitted fragments of the phrases Ave Dominus Nox and We have come for you, further confirmation of the Night Lord's involvement. Conclusion: the Breaker's Point massacre, as it has come to be known, stands as a grim testament to the Night Lord's continued predations in the Imperium's fringes. though the attack achieved its aim of terror, with hundreds butchered and the settlement in flames. It was not the absolute victory the enemy desired. Through selfless courage and collective defiance, ordinary citizens of Kortusa denied the Night Lords a complete triumph. It is the recommendation of this investigator that key individuals be honored for their heroism. Their actions turned what could have been utter annihilation into a tale of survival against impossible odds. This incident, while tragic, should be documented and studied as a case of effective civilian resistance against traitor Astartes, to inspire other frontier worlds that find themselves in the crosshairs of the long night. End report. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But even in such darkness, the light of human courage endures. Breaker's Point, drenched in blood and sorrow, did not kneel to terror. The few who survived did so because brave souls chose to stand and fight when all hope seemed lost. Their sacrifice ensured that the Imperium's flame on Kortusa was not completely extinguished, and as long as even a few still lived to whisper the Emperor's name and tell the tale, the arch-enemy's goal, the utter despair and domination of humankind, remains unfulfilled. Thus ends Terror from the Tides. The echoes of this nightmare ebb with the dying light of dawn, yet its darkness will linger. If this tale gripped you, let it be known. Honor it with a like, so its reach extends to other lost souls. We welcome your reflections and whispers in the commentaria below. Tell us which moment from the story will haunt you in the dark hours, or light a beacon of hope. To join us on our next descent into darkness, subscribe to Grimdark Shards and hit the bell of notification. By doing so, you shall be summoned whenever we unveil another grim saga from the 41st millennium. Support, as always, remains appreciated, not mandated. Those who wish to offer tribute can find the link in the archives below. Until we meet again in the abyss, stay vigilant in the darkness. And remember, even in solace, terror may rise with the tide. Farewell, Shardwalker.